Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this new episode in our series Careers in the Jewelry Industry. I'm your host, Sonia Esther Soltani. I'm the editor-in-chief of Rappaport. We're recording this live at a bit of an unusual time for us because of, hi Glenn, I'm going to tell you about our guest in a second. Our guest is Glenn Preus, who's joining me from Hawaii. So for Glenn, it's actually Wednesday evening, and for me, it's Thursday morning already. So if you're missing this live because it's a bit of a weird time for you, and don't worry, it's going to be recorded on this account and also on our YouTube platform. So you'll have opportunities to catch up with us later. But if you're joining us today, thank you so much. And please, please, please ask questions because Glenn has so much to share for anyone interested in the art of cutting, in lapidary. So let me introduce you to our guest today. Glenn is a lapidary artist, works with natural gemstones, creates the most wonderful cuts. I encourage you to go and check his Instagram account if you're not already following him. Hi, Glenn. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Hey, thank you, Sonia. Pleasure to be here.
So tell me, when did you become a gem cutter?
It's kind of a long story, but I started cutting about 23 years ago. But I've been in the industry for 40 plus years. So I came to it late, but came to it with an interesting perspective that is a little bit unique. Most people in the craft end of our industry, whether they're bench jewelers or designers, or they don't come from the business end of it. They come more from the hobby area of it and then make it a career. And so I started differently, basically as a stone dealer. And prior to that, I actually started my career at Harry Winston in New York back in, I'll date myself here, but back in 1980. And then prior to that, I was in college here in Honolulu. So I was fortunate enough to start my career there. That exposed me to very unique pieces of jewelry, obviously, at Harry Winston. Some fabulous gemstones and diamonds and jewelry from them, kind of learning it old school. But that's kind of like a little backstory about how I got into the industry. And while at Harry Winston, I was really intrigued with diamond cutting operations. So what was different then about firms today is back then everything was vertically integrated. So at their operations in Manhattan at 56th and 5th Avenue was their townhome location, 5 stories. So it was Candyland for somebody like me who's fresh out of college, just starting there. So the first floor was the salon. Second floor was procurement and Mr. Winston's office. At that time when I joined the firm, it was Ronald Winston, his son, running the company. The third floor was hand fabrication of jewelry. The fourth floor was diamond cutting, and the 5th floor was their wholesale division. So all of that was vertically integrated in one building. So why am I going into all this detail? Well, I would spend all my break time with the diamond cutters on the 4th floor. And watching them cut, I had a fascination for it. I really got into this industry because I love gemstones. And just watching the cutters cut, and then the foreman or the shop manager, he was always kind with his time, would sit me down and would go over rough, would look at diamond rough, he'd show me why he was marking the rough in certain ways with old school. Now, this is before computerization. He had to hand mark everything with what's called India ink to where the stone was going to be cut or sawed, depending on the flaws, the orientation of the rough. We would work with the rough, looking at it in 3-dimensional schemes, because you have to determine what's the best orientation for the piece of rough. So that kindled this passion for rough stones with me and cutting. And I kind of held that forward through the decades. So that's kind of the origin story of how did I get interested in cutting. I didn't actually start cutting until 20 years later. So I spent 3 years with the firm and then returned to Hawaii and started my own business importing, exporting colored stones. And so working as a dealer, supplying jewelers, all over with their gemstones. So that was kind of the genesis of this. 20 years later, with that kind of experience, always had in the back of my mind, I wanted to get into cutting. And with gemstones, it was kind of an idea of passion, Sonia, but also competitive needs. The absolute need to build a better mousetrap to be competitive, because at a certain level, we're all selling to the same houses. So I have to be better than somebody else. And somebody else may have like much more capital and inventory than I do, but I have to find a way to make my own niche. So I decided okay, I'm going to do some things differently. I'm going to only concentrate on untreated color. So that means no heat, no irradiation, no chemical diffusion, none of it, just the colors as they come out of the ground, and all my own thing. So that was my goal. Okay, that's the ship you're going to sail across the ocean, but you got to build the ship first, right? So.
And who was your captain? Who taught you to cut? I mean, you had been in one of the best houses in the world, or maison of the world, but how do you actually yourself, like there's a difference between looking at the cutter and also diamond and gemstones. I think if you can maybe explain the difference between cutting the two different things, even if they both come from the earth. So
yeah, diamond cutting and gemstone cutting, similar but different. You need different equipment. There are different aspects to cutting a diamond that is so different from cutting a sapphire, which is also different from cutting an alexandrite or cutting an amethyst. So each stone species does have its own set of rules. How did I actually kind of get in with this kind of backstory that's a little bit unique? Now, okay, how do you start to cut a stone? I'm not a mechanical person, so I kind of researched cutting machines. Now, to get into this, we have to understand cutting overseas in factories is done kind of with not sophisticated equipment. A lot of it is called jam peg faceting, where they're holding hand pieces and not sophisticated machinery at all. And then we have the American faceting machines, which basically were started to be manufactured in the 60s and 70s to fulfill a hobby need of American cutters. That was a burgeoning industry for hobby cutters. And certain machine companies would start making these faceting machines very accurate, and you could set the angles and everything, would be accurate, but you still had to know how to use it. To your question, how do you start using it? So again, I'm not a mechanical person, so I called up one faceting machine company that I was interested in perhaps using the machine, and they told me, okay, you can go to, there's a guy down in Tennessee teaching people on this machine. So I said, okay, I'll start there. So I went to Tennessee and learned how to use this specific machine, and how to set the angles and all this kind of stuff. And that's your introduction to cutting and something called meat point faceting. So not to get too technical, but there's a way, it's kind of the American hobby system of learning how to cut, as opposed to apprenticing over in Germany or Brazil or in Bangkok or Jaipur. The American faceting is kind of based on what's called meat point faceting, where you have these computerized, now it's computerized, back then it was not computerized, it was mathematically done by hand, angles to cut to a certain depth, and then you can then cut another facet to meet that, and you meet that point, and then meet that point, build upon that, and all of a sudden you're shaping the stone. So that's one way of cutting. That's basically how American cutters learn, and it made zero sense to me. I was like, reading a cutting diagram, the instructions, and kind of draw that kind of analogy with musicians. Sonia, if you can imagine, some musicians read sheet music beautifully. They are virtuosos. They can, read anything, play beautifully. They're world-renowned musicians in an orchestra, for instance. Then you have other musicians that are, lost looking at a piece of music. They have to work by ear. They have absolutely no idea how to read a sheet of music. It looks like gibberish to them. And I'm kind of that way. I look at a faceting diagram and I don't know where to begin. It makes no sense. So I complicated things because now I have to start to teach myself and not using diagrams. Plus I had in my mind, how do I want a stone to look? I had to harken back on my days at Harry Winston, how their cutters were cutting their colored stones quite a bit different from others. And it just had facet patterns that were unique to my eye that really drew me in. So I had to work back on those influences and then self-teach myself from there.
Wow.
With cutting, YouTube wasn't invented yet, so you couldn't go on the YouTube channels to look. there weren't really other cutting schools I could go to kind of teach what I was yearning to teach myself. So I just had to kind of do it by trial and error and make it up as I go along. And it's something that if you have enough passion to it, just like playing an instrument, yes, you can pick it up yourself and teach yourself and go from there. So that's kind of my backstory with that. It's kind of long-winded, but it's kind of hard to answer it in a couple of sentences.
Not at all. It's fascinating. You're more like a jazz player than
Yeah. So it's a lot of trial and error. Back then, there were some forums. This is the early stages of the internet when I started. There were some forums like the U.S. Fasteners Guild. So I would kind of lurk on those things and read what some people were saying about this or that, and then try to apply what I was doing to it. And the unique thing about gemstone cutting, especially polishing, is if we had a room of 10 cutters here and you were to ask them all, how do you polish a gemstone? And you ask 10 cutters, you'd get about 22 different answers. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's predicated on what type of polishing compounds you're using, the methods, your hand pressure, how wet the lap is. The lap is the diamond cutting wheel. In colored stones, we call that cutting wheel a lap. So, how wet or dry that lap is compared to your hand pressure that you're applying. So it gets overly complicated, and everybody has varying results. So what works for me doesn't work for somebody else, and vice versa. So it's kind of like you have to kind of really develop your own techniques that work for you. There are today, I think your one question was kind of how do you learn? And for cutters today to learn, I think there are YouTube channels that you can go to and get the basics and whatnot. And depending on how far you want to go with it, if you want to be totally professional or just hobby, then you can develop your own styles and go forward at your own pace. But for me, I just kind of, totally immersed myself. Because again, I had a vision about what I wanted my stones to look like just based on my prior experiences. And then I had to find out how to arrive to that point. And there's a lot of midnight cutting.
We have a few really interesting questions. I'm going to ask them to Glenn, but I want to ask him first. When was the first stone that you cut that you felt like, this is my moment. This is it. I got it.
Right.
When was it and which stone was it?
Yeah. So that aha moment where I was like really empowered. I'm like, okay, I've got this. I cut a pair of unheated aquamarines in a cushion design, which would become known as today, it's known as my OG cushion design. So it's a matching pair, 3 carats each, aquamarine, beautiful quality. The cutting, when I cut matching pairs, obviously everyone wants the colors to match, which in untreated colors is difficult because you have these undertones that are complex. But everything did work well and match well. And the way I cut it, the flashes of each stone matched. So they kind of danced together rhythmically. So I was really proud of that. And then I submitted them to Harry Winston. And when I started my own business throughout the next 15 or so years, was doing business with them and other companies in New York that I had relationships with, Tiffany and Bulgari, etc. But I submitted them to the buyer, and this is my first stones that I personally cut, submitted to them, and they like instantly bought them and said, what else do you got?
Wow.
And that gave me the everybody, I guess, needs some validation at some point in their life, and that gave me the impetus to really go hard at this, that I was in the right direction, and it made all those late night cutting sessions easy. It wasn't work because, when you get that kind of push in the right direction, that validation, it makes things easy.
Fantastic. Because you came to it a bit later, there's always something we're interested in series to know when people start their new career, they love gemstones, they become a gemologist, but everything comes, from passion. I think that's what we've noticed in this series so far.
Yeah, and you and I, we have a deep passion for this industry. We share this. We've been Instagram buddies for a couple of years now, at least.
Yes, true.
And we share this passion, whether it's for stones or diamonds, pearls, or just design in general, or the beautiful hand fabrications that's out there, or the beautiful CAD artists that are out there making these wonderful designs. So, we share this unique passion. So this conversation can go on and on and on because we have obviously a lot to talk about.
Absolutely.
But to your point, it centers around passion.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. There was one question that I thought, first, there's a few comments I want to share. Someone said that she cherishes the engagement ring that you cut for her a few years ago. A few people have been your clients and big fans of your cuts and already made comments. So that's really nice to see. But there's one really nice question, I think, for people who are really, really interested in the specificities of cuts. Is your cutting style more old world style, antique cuts, or mine cuts, cushion cuts? And obviously you have this signature cushion cut. What other cuts are part of your lexicon, so to speak?
Yeah, good question. Thank you. So my style definitely, as people cruise through my Instagram, definitely you can see my stones are characterized by big, broad facets. And I get that from my renditions of, say, how the Hope Diamond was cut, a cushion cut with large, big, chunky facets. That's kind of like a good inspiration for me. Again, back in my days at Harry Winston, the stones that really attracted my eye had these unique, big, broad facet patterns, very linear, yet encapsulated or encased in a curvy oval design, for instance, but with very linear, broad facets. And not many other cutters were doing that. And that's kind of like my eye just went to that, and I'm like a one-trick pony. That's it. That's the look that I want to get. So definitely inspired from those old style cuttings. My cutting style is vibing heavily from cutters in Paris and London. And that's kind of the genesis of that kind of style of cutting. And one very, very famous cutter that is kind of legendary in our business, Reggie Miller, his protege, now runs his company, a very big influence on me as well. They did a lot of cutting for Harry Winston, still do, but very unique in the faceting of kind of that old world charm with fastidious detail. So that's kind of the theme of my cutting as well. I do branch out. The second part of that question was believe is kind of what other cuts do I do? And that is often dictated by the shape of the rough. So I'll get kind of funky and I'll do like a cut that I kind of have a series with. I call it a tequila infused crash baguette. So I'll take a large baguette cut, say of an aquamarine, and I'll kind of warp it. So it almost looks like Dolly did it or something. And, or like a crash watch from Cartier, how it's kind of warped. So I'll do funky things like that if the rough allows me to. But I have to kind of dictate what the rough wants. And because I am cutting natural color, that rough is always much more pricey than treated stones. So if I was cutting, treated citrine or lemon quartz or things like that, you could go crazy with, wild fantasy cuts and whatnot. But when you're dealing in the higher end stones, the material is too valuable to start chopping away, making exotic cuts. But I do appreciate them. I'm not big into concave cutting. I don't do any of that myself. I appreciate it as an art form, but it doesn't achieve the goal that I have in cutting, which is I want that stone to be cut for dynamic movement. And what I mean by that is if he or she's wearing that stone at arm's length and they're in a restaurant and it's flashing around, and I always use this example with clients, if they're holding a wine glass and that stone is sparking in oblique directions and not spilling any of its color or any of its brilliance due to windowing or other cutting defaults, but if it's cut for what I call dynamic movement, it's sparking at these oblique angles. That's the goal that I have. I can't get that with other of these fantasy cuts that are out there. They're great for static view and macro photographs. They look wonderful. But when they're in a restaurant moving dynamically, they kind of get lost. Some of the details are so minute that they get lost at arm's length. So my cutting style is completely different, where I want that stone to be the star at arm's length. So my goal is to have somebody wearing my ring or wearing my stone in a beautiful design ring from a client, and they're at that restaurant holding that wine glass, and somebody from the next table over is commenting, "Wow, I never saw a stone sparkle like that."
I
They're,
like I like
they can,
that. I like that as a goal.
yeah, that is my goal with every stone I cut. So it's to have that three-dimensional aspect to it. I want it to perform at many different angles, not just looking great with perfect jewelry store lighting, static in a showcase. That's not my goal. So, so all of this back in now, you got to teach yourself and play with all the angles to make all this work, because none of that's written down. You know, you just have to kind of experiment to find out what works and what doesn't work.
Absolutely. And actually, as you said, each cutter, each master lapidary artist has his own techniques, has to develop his signature, his vision, his touch, so people who are in the know recognize who did it. But what do you think are the skills, the set of skills that someone who would like to become a cutter today would need? Just the basic skills then to grow their own style on this basis.
Yeah, so no matter where your starting point is, if you're brand new to the industry, you came from another discipline, another industry, and you decided to come into the jewelry industry, whether you're that new to it or you've been in it a while and decided that, yes, you want to also explore being a bench jeweler and maybe even a stone cutter. However that origin starts, some foundational skill sets I think you need is you have to be willing to be very detail orientated. I mean, that should go without saying, right? You have to really be fastidious with your detail, because you are dealing in the gemstone world, you're dealing with minutia, right? So every little flaw that you're dealing with on a microscopic level has to be dealt with. You have to make that decision, either leave it in the stone or get rid of it. So you have to be fastidious with detail. That's one thing. If you have an artistic background, that's great. I didn't. I had a stone background. I had a passion for jewelry design, but I wasn't a jewelry designer. I had a passion for workmanship, but I wasn't a bench jeweler. I came more from the dealer side of it. So that's another side. You can come from that angle as well. If you have an idea of what you want, if you just want to cut stones, you can do that too. That's more I'd say that's more at the hobby level, just to be able to say you did it. But if you want to kind of carve your own niche, which today in business, I think you'll agree, everybody has to have a defendable niche to be in business today. It's just everything is so competitive. So, if you want to get into this as a business and not just a novelty hobby, you got to be, headstrong. And, if you wanted to be you wanted to be a surgeon or you wanted to be a musician, you have to be equally dedicated, to rise to that top. So, you need that ability to be super dedicated and, be goal orientated and kind of know what direction you want to be into. So, yeah, kind of all of that above. If you want to do this professionally.
Yeah, I think that's the thing. That's really to raise your game, to be in a small group of people who have already established the signature. And actually, that's a question I wanted to ask you. And I saw one of our audience also has this question. I think that's something. Is lapidary art a dying art? Is there a next generation of artists who actually, there's something funny enough, we're covering in the next Rappaport magazine. Kate Masters has written a really nice piece about it. But what is there a next generation? Are people being trained to the level of excellence?
Yeah, there's no apprenticeships in the U.S. But I've done some Instagram posts on this, and for the jewelers that are watching this, my Instagram does have a lot of pretty pictures and whatnot, and but I also do a lot of posts where my goal is to help jewelers sell more colored stones and point out some of the speed bumps that they have in selling color. They come from the diamond world, and it's more difficult to sell color than diamond. And many jewelers fail because they just can't get over the hump of how to do it properly. So I do a lot of posts on this. And to your specific point, I've done some posts on what makes me excited about the industry today. And I'm more excited about the industry today than I ever have been. And Sonia, that's because I see not a dying industry, but a thriving, growing industry. So I talked about this before, where I see, for instance, hand fabrication of jewelry. Let's just go that route for the moment. Back in the 80s and 90s, with every jeweler offshoring their production overseas for the cheapest low-cost way to do it, hand fabrication became a dying art. By the latter part of the 90s, it was hard to get a handmade three-stone ring. Any dealer out here that's listening knows that it was not easy to get properly made, very fine finished handmade three-stone rings. Very difficult. Fast forward to today, there's a whole new resurgence of young people coming into the industry specializing in hand fabrication. And that was a dying art 20, 30 years ago. So that's exciting. For me, that's exciting. We got guys coming into the industry learning hand fabrication, engraving. Then you have other designers embracing computers and doing CAD CAM work. They do hand rendering, of course, but they've now transitioned into CAD CAM, making manufacturing that much easier for people that want to do casting. Now, where does this land with cutting being a growing art or a dying art? For cutters now, if you're somebody like myself that's doing, unique cutting, custom cutting for unique pieces of rough, I can't survive and thrive if there's not a manufacturing industry behind me to buy the stones. So if there's not a jeweler that can somehow deal with a CAD CAM artist to make something for a uniquely shaped stone, I'm dead in the water. Mm-hmm. So if we understand that the bench arts in jewelry fabrication are thriving now, whether it's casting work, CAD work, or hand fabrication, if that's thriving, that makes the lapidary industry grow with it, because we need people that can take a funky shaped, crash baguette design and make a ring for it. Because you can't go to a casting manufacturer and say, hey, do you have anything that will fit this kind of warp shape baguette? It doesn't. They want to sell you 8x6 calibrated sizes, 7x5, whatnot. And now that CAD artists can automatically resize a stone on the computer, they can take it, if it's not 8x6, but it's 8.7 by 5.3, they can resize that on the computer and print out the wax. So that makes my job as a lapidary artist much more doable, because I can create the stones I need to based on what the rough is dictating, not cut to calibration, but cut to what the stone needs. And that allows me now an avenue to sell that. Because if I was doing this in the 80s, Sonia, where people couldn't get hand fabricated jewelry with any ease, they wanted everything calibrated so they could ship it offshore to make 7x5 rings, 7x5 halo rings or whatever. So the lapidary arts has the most potential, I think, that it's ever had, because the infrastructure to use our stones is there. It's growing as well. And we need good bench jewelers and great CAD artists to allow us to sell our stones.
That's great to hear. I mean, we can see from what's happening in jewelry design that, people are getting more adventurous. They play with color much more than before. They loved kite cuts or portrait cuts. All these cuts are really, really funky and a bit different and a bit more edgy.
It's exciting. We get excited talking about it, but can you imagine the client that is, at night home during the pandemic, just scrolling through Instagram? They're on their phone scrolling and they're seeing all these wonderful designs and then these unique stones. They're like, wow, I've never seen things like this, and it's a lot of this growth happened because of Instagram. And that's empowering designers to get more bold. Like you're saying, they're getting more funky in their designs. They're calling back on fashion history much more than they had ever done before. And that's due to Instagram. There's this mass amount of digital exposure that is inspiring. Art inspires art always,
Yeah.
and it's always influenced. Each art movement influences the next. And we see this kind of turbocharge with something like Instagram, with the digital transformation of our industry. So yeah, I think all the arts of our industry can thrive now, and continue to thrive. Like I say, I'm more excited than ever about
Very
what,
good to hear. I had actually, speaking with you, I have this question. How do you work with designers? So do you offer them your stone already cut, or they ask for something specific? What is the creative process between you as the lapidary artist and the designer that has a vision for the jewelry?
Right. Very good question. It comes up all the time. For me, I want to cut the stone first because, again, this is what nature is giving. I do get requests from designers all the time. Can you cut this shape or that? Can you do this? Can you do this? And I'm saying, like, I can try, but I can't guarantee, because I don't have cookie cutter rough. I can't go to Mother Nature and say, all right, let me pluck from your tree, this shaped stone that I can cut into this, unique shape for this designer. If I was cutting very inexpensive rough, not the type of material that I'm cutting, you could maybe do that. But with the material I'm cutting, it has to start with the stone. So it's more like I can get an idea from a designer, which happens all the time. They're like, I'm looking for something like this. Do you have an elongated cushion cut? I've seen this on your Instagram. Do you have any more like this? Can you cut something? And I'll make notes, and I'll keep in touch with that designer when I can do it, when something does present itself that I can cut. Believe me, I have a stack of notes from designers from all over the world, like waiting for this, waiting for that, waiting for that. And as soon as I can cut it. I wish it was that easy where I could, get a request from a designer to, cut this stone, this size, but with the type of stones I'm cutting, it doesn't work that way.
Makes sense. So that would be your advice to designers to really follow, to dance with the stone as well, right? To the same way as you dance with the rough to bring out the best polish, to also get the stone and then create something around that stone.
Yeah, love the analogy and the question in general. Sonia, so the inspiration that they get inspires me and vice versa. So there is a back and forth, because when I started at Harry Winston, one of the first things that they did in training me was to look at stones, sort them, and then lay them out on wax for the world famous designer Shindy would say he was making up a bib necklace, and it would be sapphires and emeralds and diamonds. So what they trained me at first before I got into sales there was to pick the stones for the design, and the design would be traced on a sheet of wax, Sonia. So I would then pick the stones and put them on the wax in the design tracing. Then that sheet of wax would be taken up to the third floor, and the hand fabricators would make the jewelry. So I'm used to working with designers and understanding their needs and whatnot. So that kind of origin story there has worked well for me, many decades later into this conversation, working with current designers today. And we communicate really well. So when I am working with designers, and designers are probably a good 80% of my clientele, or retailers that have a design capacity, jewelers that have embraced design themselves with CAD/CAM as an example, or they are able to subcontract it out. That's the main core of my clientele. So working with them, and again, getting all requests, like, I'm looking for something like this. Are you going to be cutting something like that? Do you have it? So always my back of my mind and my notes on clients is always, working towards that end. And for me, it's fun because working with designers, don't judge me because I don't know anything about fashion. I'm the worst one to look for fashion, but I really enjoy it. I had to learn it. Obviously it doesn't come easy for me, but I really embrace design, and I wish the rest of our industry would embrace it more. Our industry has always lagged the fashion world. I've always been jealous that we're not joined at the hip with the fashion world. I'm sure you kind of feel the same way. It's getting better and better, and certain designers are very accelerated at it and others are not. So that's something that for me, I just, really wish that the industry would keep getting tighter and tighter with fashion. because I can't see a world where, as jewelry designers or cutters, if we don't have our finger on the fashion pulse, we're in the wrong, missing the point. So I'm happy that we are seeing more and more progress as our industry is getting closer with the fashion industry. And it's just fun for me, somebody who enjoys the fashion over the decades. For instance, I just love to see the fashion revivals now coming from the 70s. 60s have been so powerful for the last decade plus in fashion design. Now we're seeing the 70s, this last 5 years has been a heavy 70s influence. Where am I going with this? Well, we're starting to see that in jewelry too. We're starting to see more of that 70s style cocktail ring come out, that ballerina style ring. One of my favorite designers that I love working with, they kind of had this theme that they made themselves. It looks like a 1970s cocktail ring falling down the stairs. and that's kind of their look. That's their theme. And I love that. It's like, how cool is that? I mean, wouldn't you want to own something like that today? I mean, just talking about it, gets somebody interested. So for me, working with designers that have hard working desire with fashion, that are really in tune with fashion, that makes my job more pleasurable and also easier, because it allows me to get a little bit more, funky with colors, color mixing and matching, things like that all come into play.
And also, I think we have more designers coming from the fashion world, actually choosing their second career, coming from, more the apparel world and getting into fine jewelry. And that's really exciting, because I think they bring this fresh, new, bold vision to that design. So I'm also watching this space quite excitedly. And Glenn, we speak all day, but from one of our audience, because I think that's a great question. Is there someone called James World AU, who I think said also they've been dealing with you and they have some of your stones? Is there someone who will carry your legacy in the future? Do you conduct gem cutting classes? I know you mentioned YouTube. Can we find you on YouTube giving classes, or it's not really?
I'm not a teacher. I wouldn't be good at it, that's for sure. So yeah, legacy going forward, I don't know. But I'm not. I don't do any teaching in class or classes, anything like that. I'm too ingrained with what I'm doing, and there's not enough hours in the day to do everything, unfortunately.
I understand. It's very different skills as well. I think there's what lots of people think. Sometimes you need to be complete immersed in your creative process, and that's really the focus.
Yeah.
And someone said something very nice. They said that what they love is the way you do. Is your cutting help the eye to rest and enjoy what colors are coming towards you, which I think is a really nice way to describe your style.
Nice. Yeah, I like that. That's certainly one of my goals is, again, if with gemstones, it's totally different from diamonds, and this is where jewelers always fail in selling color when they want to explore color, because they'll read Rappaport magazine about color is good, you should branch off to it and whatnot, but they make mistakes because they're so diamond centric. They're not realizing that their clients coming into their store, they're pre-sold on diamonds. Their mother and their grandmother have been listening to ads their whole life about diamonds forever, etc. They have to get a diamond engagement ring, the bigger the better. But today, a lot of the young people coming up are very curious about colored stones, but the jewelers may be lagging behind a little bit. Some of the mistakes they make is trying to just present a look, like, okay, this is a blue sapphire. Yeah, it's blue, and it's set in a nice halo ring, isn't it? Yeah, okay, it's pretty, isn't it? And the customer's like, yeah, maybe not. It's like it with colored stones. It has to hit the eye with a visceral reaction within 2 seconds. If that doesn't spark a visceral reaction in the client, as she's looking at the showcase in the jewelry store, if there's not a visceral reaction from that stone within 2 seconds, she's on to the next showcase or the next store or the next website or whatever. So the stone has to spark that visceral reaction, because unlike our cousins in the diamond industry, we don't have decades and decades of generic advertising behind sapphires or aquamarines or Molly garnets. We don't have that generic advertising. The only way a gemstone can sell is on its own beauty. It has to have its own merits. So that's jewelers that buy bluff stones, when they buy a bluff colored stone, when I mean bluff, something that maybe looks bigger than it is, it's cut shallow so it spreads bigger, but when you cut a stone shallow, it windows out and you lose all that, beautiful brilliance that a stone should have. And they think that's good enough, because it's in their store, to get the store name behind them, and they think that's good enough to sell. But it fails miserably because the client simply thinks it's ugly. And the jeweler gets upset and says, I can't sell color in my town. They don't understand color. And it's not that they don't understand color, it's just that you're not presenting it properly. And most designers that are putting their heart and soul into a design, some of the designers that they are, they're putting hours and hours into their design. They also realize that they have to put a comparable stone in there also. They can't just put a generic stone in that design that they've spent maybe days on, and otherwise they're like shooting themselves in the foot. They have to put in a proper stone. It doesn't have to be a super expensive stone, but it has to be a proper stone that's cut well, that will perform just like their design performs. So you can't put a bad stone in a great design and hope the name of the designer will sell it. They have to complete the picture. And most of the designers now that are making beautiful pieces are also using beautiful stones. So they realize that there has to be that symbiotic relationship between the design and the stone.
I like it. I like because I feel like there's a lot of optimism coming, that things are moving to the right direction, that people are appreciating color stone. There's still a lot of education to be done, but people are talking more and more about color gemstones for the engagement ring. Yeah, and I think what's very interesting for us to see is like more and more women are buying their own jewelry, and they're not buying a diamond piece, they're buying very often a color gemstone piece. So that's also something, because it seems like there's going to be a bigger appreciation of the artistry that goes into a really well-cut color gemstone. So with all the amazing spectrum of color as well that comes with it. So Glenn, I like it. I like that we're looking forward with optimism and not just saying, there's I think there's a lot to take on from our conversation.
Yeah.
You last word of advice or wisdom, or what did you learn in these 20 years as a cutter that you would like to pass on as a word of wisdom, not as a...
My best advice for someone, I think it would be twofold. One, you've got to carve out your own style and taste. That's as a gemstone artist, also as a designer as well, obviously. But specifically, we are talking about the gemstone arts. So you have to develop your own style and taste. It's all about being in a good niche for yourself, because the world is so competitive. If you just want to just like cut a stone and sell a stone, I mean, the whole world's doing that. So you have to create a unique brand promise for yourself, and that something that your customers can count on. So develop your own style and taste. And there's a second part of that is you just have to work harder than the next person. I mean, there's no getting around hours and hours and hours of practice and trial and error. I mean, there's no getting around it. I mean, you just have to put the time in. So if you can combine those two things, then yeah, you can have a future. If you combine one without the other, it's not going to work. You have to be a viable brand for your clientele. You have to be able to put those pieces together.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Dan. I really appreciate. As I said, we could go on for much longer. I think we'll carry on this conversation because there's still so much more to discuss. The gemstone and the rough, and how you pick the rough, and the different color gemstones. We haven't even touched on the different color gemstones you work with. So we'll carry on this conversation. But I would like to thank you and thanks everyone who joined us. And I'd just like to tell Yuma, if you're still with us, that please DM us the question. I will get you the information about this cocktail ring designer after this live. So please just send us a direct message. So, actually, Yuma has asked another question I would like to finish on the word of wisdom career-wise, but I'm going to ask you because I think there's also something that's very, very interesting for people who love gemstones and who are in the business, what is your take on lab-grown diamonds? I know you obviously only deal with color gemstones, so is it something that you have an opinion about, or you just, that's so not your field that you're not interested?
Yeah, I do have an opinion. I mean, I've been in this industry a lifetime now, so I kind of have maybe a word or two to say on the subject. I appreciate technology. That's, I can appreciate that. For people that are going to get engaged, I'll pose this question to you. If you're thinking about a natural diamond versus a lab-grown diamond, and this could also be, in the colored stone world, natural ruby versus a synthetic ruby, a lab-grown ruby, which has been around for over 100 years. So in the colored stone world, we're kind of adept at this already. But in the lab-grown diamond world, my question to that young buyer that's out there would be, would you rather have something on your finger, or your wife's or your fiance's finger for the rest of her life that was made in the earth 2 billion years ago, or something that was made on a factory floor 5 months ago? And if those words don't mean anything to you, buy a lab-grown diamond. If those words resonate with you about owning something, formed 2 billion years ago in the earth, if that catches you, which I pray that it does with people. I mean, wearing a piece of Earth's history should be an honor that we should all strive for. If that resonates with you, then yes, you have to buy a natural diamond. But again, to each his own, and I'll kind of leave it with that analogy. How do you value something worth 2 billion years old?
Absolutely. And just for reminder, if people have just joined us, Glenn only works with untreated natural color gemstones. I think that's something very, very important as part of his beautiful offering to people who work with him. And I like the analogy as well that you've just drawn for diamonds. So thank you so much, like everyone who joined us. As I said, this is recorded and going to be hosted on our platform on Rapaport Report, on Instagram, on YouTube. So if you missed the beginning of this conversation, because we have a bit of a off timing today, just to allow us, for Glenn and me, to be together in the same time frame, please watch the recording. If you have any questions for Glenn, you can send it to us. We'll pass it on to him. You can contact him directly. If you're not following him already, please do on Instagram. Beautiful stones. You learn so much about cuts, about color gemstones, and it's dreamy. And also, sometimes you'll get some pictures of Hawaii. So if you're at the office in an empty space, suddenly you'll see Hawaii, and that will make you happy for the whole day. I'm very happy. Someone said they love the late night live. So thanks for joining us. I guess you're joining us from America.
Where in the world they are, yeah.
Then, as I said, we'll carry on this conversation. But for all our followers, I wish you either a good night or a very good day wherever you're joining us from.
Great, thank you.
Thanks, Glenn. Thank you. Bye-bye. Oh, someone from Nashville. So we're happy to have kept you entertained a bit later. Thank you so much. And as I said, please don't hesitate to send us direct messages to Instagram channel for anything you want answered, and we'll get back to you. Have a great day, and thank you, Glenn, for your time and all your insights.